Okay guys, so in this presentation we're going to go over the essentials of metabolic conditioning for athletes, and what we're going to talk about is what exactly we mean by metabolic conditioning, why do we need to do this sort of training, and how can we then best use this information to actually train our athletes. So if we sort of break down this term metabolic conditioning, we get the first word metabolic, which refers to metabolism, which is basically energy production by the body. Then we get conditioning, which is basically going to refer to training or optimizing this energy production. So what we get is this general definition that metabolic conditioning is optimizing energy system efficiency, and that's going to be specific to the sport. And this is a bit of a complex topic, but basically anything we do requires energy production. So it's really going to be specific to each sport, meaning that if we have a sport that involves lots of low intensity but high distance running, it's going to be a lot different to a sport that's going to require lots of high intensity sprinting over shorter distances. And the energy systems required to produce energy for those activities are going to be quite different. So if we look at this energy system interplay, we have this graph here, which is basically going to talk about intensity, and this one has power here, which basically refers to intensity in the unit of power, and we have time. So think about this graph here as someone doing some sort of activity at 100% effort for 3 to 4 hours. So we have a few of these different energy systems, which is not 100% important to understand each one in detail, but basically what we can see is sort of these first few energy systems, what we call the anaerobic energy systems, and they're going to allow for really high powers or really high intensities up here, but you can see that their duration is all these anaerobic systems are only going to last up to about 30 to 60 seconds. So their intensity is going to be really high, but their capacity is very low. And then we have these other systems here that are our aerobic systems, and you can see that from after about 30 to 60 seconds, these aerobic systems are going to become dominant for after 36 seconds all the way to multiple hours. So these have really big capacity, but as we can see, our intensity is a lot lower than our anaerobic systems. And one thing to note is also that we're not exactly producing energy from one system at a time. All these systems are actually used all the time, but just there's different systems that are going to be dominant at different times. So that's why we call it energy system interplay. Okay, so if the aim for a certain sport, such as a 400-meter sprint, is going to be, if we look back to this graph, so a 400-meter sprint is going to be around in this 30 to 60 second mark. So from 0 to 30 to 60 seconds, we're probably going to be pretty anaerobic, and this sort of anaerobic glycolytic system is probably going to be dominant for most of that event. And then if we have something like a marathon race, for example, where the aerobic systems are going to be really dominant, we can the sport is basically to optimize those systems. But what happens when we have an intermittent sport where it's not one intensity the entire time? It's multiple intensities and multiple durations. We have all these different activities. How can we then optimize our energy system production and train appropriately? So basically, most team sports, for example, or intermittent sports, they involve periods of really high intensity activity, such as what this guy's doing. He's sprinting and palming off a guy playing rugby, and then that's interspersed with really sort of low intensity activity where they're either really light jogging or walking around. And basically this is the case because firstly, we cannot maintain a high intensity the entire time. We could maintain a moderate intensity the entire time, but if we do that, then when we actually need to work, it's not going to be as effective as if we were putting in a high effort. So that's why it's sort of interspersed with these sort of very low and then very high activities. So from the sport that we're looking at, depending on what it is, we can get this sort of general work to rest ratio. And what that means is basically when we're sort of doing those really high intensity efforts, how long are we doing them for? And then we compare that to how long we are doing the low intensity efforts. So we get sort of a work to rest ratio, which might be something like 1 to 5, for example, for a particular sport. So we're doing for every 1 minute or 1 second of work that we're doing, we've got 5 minutes or 5 seconds of really low intensity. And we can then also, when we get that work to rest ratio, we can also determine how intense are both of those activities, the work and the rest. So is the work while we're playing a rugby game, is that maximal intensity? And we can measure that in a few different ways. And then is that rest when we're not doing our high intensity work? Is that walking? Are we jogging? What sort of intensities are we working at? And that can be measured in a few ways: power, speed, things like that, meters per second, and we can use GPS, which can really help with this. That way, it gives us an objective measure of exactly what intensity we're working at and the duration of these work periods and rest periods. So when we sort of have this a general idea of what our work and rest periods are and this ratio, we can sort of then start to determine what energy systems are actually dominant at these times. So let's take this guy playing AFL, for example. He's either jumping and sprinting or doing something, making a mark, or he's waiting for the next play to be involved in. So this is going to be really high intensity, and this is going to be really low intensity. So we then get this idea that during the work periods, the anaerobic systems are pretty much going to be dominant all the time. And if they're not dominant, they're probably not working hard enough. And then during the rest periods, the aerobic systems are going to be dominant. So we start to get this idea that from the energy system interplay we looked at before, we can start to determine what energy systems are going to be dominant at these different periods of the game. And from there, we can start actually determining how we're going to do conditioning for our athletes. So we're going to go through a few conditioning sort of methods. The first one we're going to talk about is anaerobic conditioning, which basically what we're referring to is anaerobic energy system production. So remember, the anaerobic systems didn't last very long, but they were very high intensity. So really, the actual anaerobic component of work is usually going to be trained through things like strength, speed, and power training, and not through separate conditioning. However, it's really what we're referring to with this conditioning is the ability to repeat these high intensity efforts, and that can be a specific metabolic conditioning training session that we can do. So really what we're referring to with anaerobic conditioning is basically repeat high intensity efforts with work to rest ratios that are going to be specific to the sport, and obviously same in specific intensities to the sport as well. Another method we can do is aerobic conditioning, which is basically when we're doing work with the aerobic system. And as we remember, the aerobic systems are usually going to be dominant during the rest periods of the sport. And the reason it's important to actually train the aerobic system is because the aerobic system is going to be what recovers the anaerobic systems during their rest periods. So after the rugby player we saw does his little sprint, maybe avoids a few players, does their play, and then he has, maybe that takes 10 seconds, and then he has 30 seconds of rest. During that 30 seconds, he's not going to be doing much work, but his aerobic system is going to be at play to help recover that anaerobic system so that he's ready to perform that next effort at a really high intensity. So that's what we get here. A well-trained aerobic system is going to allow the anaerobic system to maintain its high quality. So how we can actually implement that? Usually it's done through sort of longer duration and lower intensity exercise. Don't mind these guys; they're not wearing female beach gear. They're just wearing GPS devices. So basically, when we're doing aerobic conditioning, what we want to do is we want the work to be done by the aerobic system. That's why we want the lower intensities and the longer durations, because if we go really high intensity, we're going to be using the anaerobic systems. So that's sort of our more general aerobic conditioning, and then we can do more specific aerobic conditioning, which is basically work ratios that are work to rest ratios that are specific to the sport, where the work is done anaerobically and then the recovery is done aerobically. So basically we're using that aerobic system to try and work to recover this anaerobic system. But then I pose this question here: is there really a difference between specific aerobic conditioning and anaerobic conditioning? Because if we go back, we sort of called anaerobic conditioning repeat high intensity efforts with specific work to rest ratios, and specific aerobic conditioning was pretty much the same thing. So is there really a difference between these two types of conditioning, or is it more of a spectrum from really long general aerobic conditioning to really specific conditioning? So moving on from the sort of typical conditioning for intermittent sports, we're also going to talk about this lactate conditioning, which is basically using that the energy system that a 400-meter runner would use. Sort of, it's not super high intensity, but it's not low intensity either. It's still anaerobic, but it's using sort of that intermediate system of the anaerobic glycolytic system. So, is it really necessary to train this energy system for intermittent sports? And it really depends on the sport. So, if we have a sport that's going to be, for example, only going to be working for no more than 5-second bursts at a time with really long recoveries, then this probably has almost no effect and no use in that athlete's conditioning. But for athletes maybe who have to do high intensity efforts for 15 plus seconds with sort of rest periods that are maybe not as long, the lactate conditioning might actually have some benefit. So when we train this lactate system, we our body can get better at buffering the lactate buildup. So we can basically more efficiently get rid of this lactate that's building up in order to keep using that system. And this is going to be important for events lasting, from around 15 to 60 seconds. So we could have, specific events like a rowing event or a running event or a swimming event that lasts in that duration, or we can have sports that are going to be that are going to involve work periods of around this sort of duration with, specific rest periods as well. And lastly, we're just going to sort of talk about how we might periodize a conditioning program, because really what we sort of determined was that anaerobic conditioning and aerobic conditioning are not really specific things that we can train. It's sort of more a spectrum. So we'd probably, for a team sport athlete, we'd probably start off with, some general aerobic conditioning, which is sort of that longer duration, lower intensity. We want the aerobic systems to do the work. And then that's going to sort of allow us to build that aerobic system, build a big base. Then we might, start doing some interval type training where we're going to up the intensity a bit, but still make it sort of longer duration. That's not specific to the sport. And we might also get that sort of lactate training in this sort of interval block here, so which may or may not be beneficial for the sport. And then we start to get more specific. So we might do some interval training that's going to be shorter duration. So maybe not 100% specific to the sport yet, but more specific. So we're slowly going from longer, and now we're going to shorter duration, but the intensity is going to be higher. Sorry. And then finally, we might do some really specific anaerobic repeat effort work. So that's when we might do, all out anaerobic efforts with really specific work to rest ratios. So we really start honing in those specific qualities that are necessary for the sport. And that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of it. See you in the next one.